Hello and welcome back to the Football Heritage podcast. I'm your host, Rory Bryce, and today I'm joined once again by Chris Lee.
Hi guys.
And I'm also joined by Dominic Bliss, who is the Head of Communications and Heritage at Corinthian-Casuals FC. Dominic, how are you doing? Thank you very much for coming on the show.
No, very well. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, this is going to be a really good chat. We are going to be talking about the entire history of Corinthian-Casuals Football Club, who I would argue are one of the most historic football clubs in England, one of the most well-known for their legacy, primarily as a kind of amateur club, but now coming into the modern day, how they've managed to cement themselves within the footballing pyramid. You know, there's a number of other clubs who are historic throughout England. I guess Wanderers FC, Corinthian-Casuals always get compared with Wanderers, when we're talking about them. But where clubs like Wanderers and other teams have sadly fallen out of existence, Corinthian-Casuals have actually managed to buck that trend and maintain this thread of continuity throughout history, and are now actually in a position where one day, you never know, they could make the Premier League. Never say never. But they're in the setup now, which is kind of what we're going to be talking about a little bit later on. But I think what's important about this episode is that we talk about this really amazing history, the trailblazing things that Corinthian-Casuals done within English football that hadn't been done before, and the impact that they actually had on world football, as well as their legacy and influence, the club identity today, and everything surrounding what is just a really, really fascinating football club that I don't really think gets spoken about in depth enough. So it's going to be a really interesting episode. Of course, Chris, you covered Corinthian-Casuals in your book Origin Stories, and you're going to be providing some very important historic context for this episode, which I'm really looking forward to hearing. As I say to you off air, there's a lot of stuff there that I wasn't actually aware of, so it's going to be good to hear that. And of course, Dominic, we're going to be talking about this role that you play within the club later on, because there's not many people within the footballing world who have heritage in their job title. So I'm really fascinated to hear a little bit more about that. But just before we kick things off, Chris, I know that you've been on this show quite a few times now, but just want to give any of our new listeners a little bit of an introduction into who you are and what you do. Sure,
I'm a marketing person by day, and then on the side I run a football blog and podcast called Outside Write. It's WRITE, and I've written 3 books on football history and ground hopping.
Excellent. Yeah, I think if any of our long-term listeners have heard of our other episodes, they'll be well acquainted with you by now, if not already, because of the work that you've been doing for a number of years now, a huge amount of time on ground hopping especially, and exploring different football and cultures around the world. Dominic, tell our listeners a little bit about you.
Yeah, I'm a football writer and historian by day, and I've spent my entire adult life writing about football, interviewing footballers, profiling footballers and managers, and investigating the most interesting historical features in the game, and fortunate enough to live up the road from Corinthian-Casuals, a club that is rich, you could say, dripping with this kind of stuff. So when I was invited down there to look into it, see if there were any stories for me to cover, it wasn't long before I got more and more deeply involved. So a friend and I began by making a podcast called Broadway to Brazil, riffing on the fact that we play on Tolworth Broadway, but our fan base, is as much in Brazil as it is there. And that's down to the fact that the Corinthian Football Club played such an important part in the foundation of the Corinthians in Brazil. But beyond that, I became more and more involved in the running of the club as a committee member, and try and do as much as I can to archive the club's history and keep its heritage alive, whilst covering the current team, because a lot of our supporters are more interested in how we're doing now, as is the case with all football clubs. And people forget that when they cover us, that there are 300 people in there each week that are much more interested in whether we're going to win against Uxbridge than they are in how we affected the game in Hungary 115 years ago. So that's something that you have to balance when you're head of media and heritage.
Yeah, true. It's a really interesting role, though. So, I mean, see, just growing up kind of around the club, were you always aware of them? Were they kind of like a bit of a staple fixture, or did it take a bit of a while for them to actually come on your radar properly and want to explore the history of them? Because I'm quite interested, if they're like your local team sort of thing. Was there kind of like this push to go and see them when you could, or was it just a case of, are these guys of the little team, but, they done some cool stuff like 100 years ago?
Yeah, for me, there's a personal reason as well. Well, first of all, I was taught by Corinthian-Casuals footballers to play the game. So my PE teachers at school, the football coaches in my school team, Sutton Grammar School, they were all Corinthian-Casuals. One of them was the manager of Corinthian-Casuals. and one of them had previously been manager and played. And another one was a player of over 300 appearances. So my school was quite tightly connected to Corinthian-Casuals in the early 2000s, late 90s. I remember the best player in the year below, who was the first team goalkeeper from the moment he was in year 10, who was really good. Gareth Williams, I remember him playing for Corinthian-Casuals and that being quite a big deal at school, that we had a teenage lad who was playing for a senior team in the non-league. So, I had this connection to Corinthian-Casuals there. Whilst I was at school, I was also doing the local coverage. I wanted to be a football writer. I volunteered at the age of 13 to do the local paper coverage for Banstead Athletic, who were my local team, and we would play Corinthian-Casuals. So when I moved to this area as a grown-up, I became immediately interested in the local non-league scene anyway, to find out that it was a team I was aware of from childhood and they had all of this incredible history behind them. The fascination was already partly there, and I just got deeper and deeper into it.
That's a really cool story, man. It's cool how they've played like this consistent role in your life without you necessarily being like close to them all the time. And it's good to know that they're out and about in the communities as well, putting these things in place in schools and having people out training people as well. So they sound like a proper community club. And I think this is what we're going to be talking about as well, as how the club have evolved through the years to get to a stage where they're able to survive, whereas a lot of other clubs have, maybe not realised that they would have to do that and maybe rested on their history and their heritage a little bit too much, expecting to just survive off the basis of that. And when you kind of need to adapt regardless of the level of football that you're at. But those are all things that we're going to cover a little bit later on. We're going to start right at the beginning. Chris is going to tell us a little bit about the footballing context and the historic and political and social context of the time, because it's quite interesting, because this is sort of the formative years of football, but we've already had a couple of decades of play now. A couple of organisations have already been set up, and football, I guess, as an organised game is starting to settle a little bit now, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think by the time Corinthians, the original Corinthians, come around in 1882, formed by a guy called Pa Jackson, who I'm sure Dominic knows far more about than me. But if you think about the whole context, football is really kind of restricted only to Britain and Ireland at this point. There are some footholds in Denmark and France, in Copenhagen and Le Havre, but very little, bit of Scandinavia, but very little outside of that. So we really are talking about a sport that looks very different to how we see it today in terms of aesthetic, what people are wearing, the markings on the pitch, the rules, etc., the point scoring. And we are 19 years after the creation of the FA rulebook in 1863. So we've had the first international match in 1872 between England and Scotland up in Glasgow. Scotland and Glasgow in particular, has become sort of the centre of this new world, effectively, at this point. And Scotland are very good. England are finding it's very hard to beat Scotland. In fact, they lose 5-1 in Scotland, I think 6-1 at home, wasn't it, with Andrew Watson as captain at the Oval. And at this point that Jackson decides that something needs to be done about this. And we are in just before the pre-professional era, right? Because professionalism, there's a thing called amateurism at this point, where you're meant to be amateur, but players are coming and playing, particularly the Lancashire clubs and the northern clubs, where their clubs are coming up in the workplace. And obviously there's a loose interpretation of this in the English game on Netflix, which people may have seen. And then around this time as well, so the pushing for professionalism, which happens in the mid-1880s, leads to the formation of the Football League, which is all Northern and Midland clubs, which shows you how the power dynamic has changed, going from Southern privately educated individuals that run the FA to being run by Northern and Midlands working class teams. So it's in this era, this kind of fear of professionalism, that Corinthians come along, but they are pretty decent. They the only team to beat the invincible Preston side of 1888-89. Obviously not in the Legal Cup, because obviously that they weren't taking part in those at that point. But they are extremely traditional. When the penalty kick comes around, they don't believe that a gentleman would deliberately foul somebody in the box to prevent a goal. And the keeper famously stands aside to let someone score a penalty, because he doesn't agree with the fact that it exists to start with. So this is the sort of context with which the Corinthians arrive in the 1880s. And I think, Dominic, you probably know more about Pa Jackson than I.
Pa Jackson, yeah. Well, we've got quite a lot of historians at Corinthian-Casuals, unsurprisingly, and they're all members and all involved in the club in other ways. One of them, Lou Walker, has written a book about Nicholas Lane Jackson, his name was, and he was called Pa because he was the father of the club, so that became his nickname. And he was sort of part FA amateur era administrational figure, this kind of austere late Victorian figure, part late Victorian middle-class impresario. And so he kind of mixed this kind of P.T. Barnum with stuffed shirt at the FA into one character. And he was a brilliant marketeer, but, whether he wouldn't have called it that. But he did a really good job of making the world think that Corinthians were the team you wanted to see in your town, in your stadium. Sometimes people will say, lazily, we're the Harlem Globetrotters of football. No. It wasn't done purely for entertainment. And in fact, in the early days, some of the players were saying, spectators were loafers. They were people who came down to pay others to play for them. And why aren't they playing football? That was the old public school code of, football's there to be enjoyed. It's a game for leisure and pleasure. That's what a Corinthian is, by the way. A Corinthian is someone who has enough wealth that they can just go and enjoy sport in most cases, but all forms of culture, and take part in it as a leisure pursuit. There used to be Corinthian boxers in the early Victorian era who would go down to bare knuckle fights in the back of pubs and turn up in their crisp white shirts and say, I'll take him on. And they weren't interested in the prize pot. They were there because they fancied themselves as a boxer. And you would get that in music, in theatre, and in sport. And that goes back to the idea that Corinth in ancient Greece was a wealthy society where people were interested in enjoying leisure. And, after the Olympic Games, the Corinth Games were the next biggest. That's what it was. So sporting pleasure, sporting leisure is where the name Corinth and Corinthians comes from. But as time evolved, even within a few years of the club forming, they realised that spectators were important to the game. And, these were people who would become supporters and they would add something to the atmosphere. And that quickly changed. So it grows out of this idea of, Victorian schoolboys believing that sport and football are there to prepare you for a manly role in the empire. And it grows into, actually, there's sports and industry, and we're an amateur team within that. We're a fascination. We'll travel around and people want to come and watch us. People will be entertained by the fact that we play without the insecurity of worrying about going through to the next round or taking maximum points. They're not playing in the league. They're not playing in the cup. They're playing for enjoyment, for pleasure, and the fans will enjoy that too. That's what makes Corinthian a really interesting team at this time where businessmen are taking over football. They're interested actually in people enjoying football. They were worried about the rapid professionalisation of football at this period, which, is happening when they're formed. And I don't think that's an accident. I think maybe Jackson felt there was a place for a select amateur team of the best players in the country to come together and show people that you didn't necessarily need to pay the best players from Scotland or the North East to come and play for your club to be the best. You could be the best by picking the best players who wanted to play to enjoy themselves. There's definitely a class element there. Look, you've got more time on your hands to enjoy sport. If you're not working extremely long days for very little pay, you're going to be eating better food. You're going to have been brought up with fresh air and better nourishment, and you're going to be bigger and stronger. And it's no surprise that the Corinthians are known for being gentlemen in the sense that they don't like anything sly or untoward going on, any dark arts, as we'd call it these days. However, they were one of, if not the most physical team. If you played against the Corinthians, you would get shoulder barged well into the 20s when it just wasn't part of the game anymore in the professional game. And there were people getting sent flying by these big strapping lads who would then sort of chortle and pick them up and say, oh, fair play, old boy. No problem, let's get on with the game. And that was what made them different. I think people were fascinated by that. The professionals liked playing against them. They found them to be nice blokes and they were different.
Can I just jump in at that point? I think that class element is a reason that they could afford to go to places like South Africa, North America and South America, which is ultimately what we're here for, Fat Corinthians, and parts of Europe and Scandinavia, because they had the money. If you look at other touring sites, Queen's Park were another amateur side, probably equivalent in many ways. They only went as far as Copenhagen and Belfast, really, when it came to touring. Clapton FC, which is the first British side at all to go abroad to tour outside the British Isles, is, they only went as far as Belgium. So a lot of them could only really jump across the channel unless you were extremely wealthy, which I imagine a lot of the Corinthians were, to be able to carry out these very long tours that they were. And going back to the gentleman thing, if you had a job, you can't take 3 or 4 months off to go touring, can you? So it must have been an element, or just play for the fun of it and have time to train, as you mentioned, Dominic. So it's kind of like that wealth is one of the reasons that enabled Corinthians to do quite an amount of touring and therefore have the global influence that they did.
What's interesting as well, though, and I think if we go back to this time period and we look at how the amateur scene is now, and in Scotland it's not, I would probably argue it's not on the same level as it is in England, but we still have things like the amateur national team have been a thing throughout history. You have things like the Amateur Cup in both Scotland and England, which have existed throughout time. So it is quite interesting how the kind of religious attachment to amateurism and the ideals behind amateurism especially have still kind of lasted to this day, And, what's weird is it kind of blurs the lines a little bit. There's a particular amateur team close to me in Scotland who can afford to pay players more than some of our non-league teams, which obviously, it defeats the purpose. But this is kind of one of the nuances of football in the modern day, is that football has evolved differently and teams want to try and compete, and they will do that however they see fit. But of course, if we told that to people back in the late 1800s, then they would have laughed at that, because that's not what amateurism is. You're supposed to do it for the love of the game. So it is just quite interesting how this fascination with amateurism has kind of maintained almost throughout history and worked its way into football in the 21st century. I find it really fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I would pick up on what Chris said is that they didn't train. So they had the time to train, but they didn't train. They didn't believe in training. They believed it wasn't the right thing to do. You're meant to be effortlessly superior. They had pockets in their kit, and they would walk onto the pitch with their hands in their pockets. They might as well have been whistling, The whole point was you're supposed to look like you're just there for a day's sport, and then you dish out the hiding of a lifetime to the FA Cup holders, which did happen. The second professional team to win the FA Cup was Blackburn Rovers in 1884. And later that year, they lost 8-1 to Corinthians. As Chris mentioned earlier, the Preston Invincible was 1888-89, the first ever Football League season. They played Corinthians 4 times that season. They won 3 times, but Corinthians won one of their games, which means they weren't invincible any more than Arsenal lost to Middlesbrough and Inter the season that they won the Premier League. They didn't lose in the league, but they weren't invincible. The Corinthians beat them. So it's an interesting point that you make about amateurism enduring to this day, but it being a kind of strange curiosity. It is an anachronism. I can say that. I'm the head of Media and Heritage at Corinthian-Casuals, and I can say that. It is an anachronism, but it's a beautiful one in the way that we now observe it, in that I think amateur football was gotten rid of from the non-league pyramid in 1974 because shamateurism had been around for 20 odd years at that point after the war. In the 50s and the 60s and the early 70s, Corinthian-Casuals pretty much always came bottom of the league, and there were some seasons where they just got it together and did a bit better, finished mid-table. They got to the Amateur Cup final in 56 at Wembley, but they lost in a replay to Bishop Auckland at Ayresome Park, and they got to the FA Cup first round in 1965 and 1982. But there have been a few times where they've got it together, but largely throughout their history as an amalgamated club, Corinthian-Casuals were finishing in the bottom 4. And it was because the other teams were paying their players. So in 1974, they made non-league semi-professional, but we remained in the league. And that's why there's this curious thing. We didn't join the amateur FA. We stayed in the league. What makes Corinthian-Casuals interesting is they're the one team that didn't go semi-pro when football went semi-pro. But, throughout history, as Chris points out, they were wealthy enough to go to South Africa. They were wealthy enough to go to South America and to the United States. There were letters to the press in the early 1900s saying that Corinthians' expenses were more than the wages that were being paid to the players they were beating. They would say, this amateur team has beaten one of the top professional teams. And then the hotel bill would come in and it would cost the club more than it would have done to pay them, a professional wage. That's why I point out about the whole not training, because amateurism meant more than not being paid to these guys in the late Victorian era. It doesn't mean that to us in this day and age. But the more I read about it, the more I realise that it was a way of life. They even wrote early on in their constitution. They wrote about how many people could be members, how many people could be on the committee. And it's an unwritten rule. In the annals, it says there's an unwritten rule that players come from a public school or university background. And that changed, midway through the 20th century. But in those early days, they really were quite snobby. It was about being a certain type of person. So, it's worth bearing that in mind. But we're not here to maintain that into the 21st century, but it's pointless us dressing it up as anything else.
Oh, 100%, 100%. And you need to, it's part of it. And like Chris has kind of alluded to, this is part of the context at the time that we can't really shy away from or ignore, because it really informs how football ends up developing going into the 20th century and how it develops to this day. But then on the other side of things, that's Corinthian, and they have an incredible history, really fascinating history. And effortless superiority is just absolutely, I really, really like that, actually. It's, you're supposed to just turn up without any training and just leather your opponents.
There is something quite adorable, to use a horrible word, about that haughtiness. There's a Czech writer who described them in one of their early tours to play Slavia Prague as saying, they were haughty and yet not haughty, which is supposed to say that essentially they came out in these pure white billowing sleeves with these beautiful CFC monograms on their shirts and their hands in their pockets, having not trained and wiped the floor with the opposition. And yet they were incredibly big on humility. So they were a bundle of contradictions to us. But at the time, there was a way of behaving where that made absolute sense.
Oh, it's almost kind of like role play, isn't it?
It would be now, but they were brought up that way. Yeah.
Yeah, we should probably mention C.B. Fry at this point, Charles Burgess Fry, who's like almost the ultimate Corinthian, you could argue, couldn't he? Because he not only plays for Corinthians and also Southampton as well in the FA Cup final in 1902, but he represents England 26 times at cricket. He plays for Barbarians at rugby. So he's a phenomenal athlete, sort of breaking records. So it's kind of, you have this kind of all-rounderness, but then again, a normal working class guy at that era wouldn't have the time or the diet, I imagine, or the connections to be able to enjoy these pursuits, unlike someone like C.B. Fry, who obviously had natural talent, but also had the time and the money.
Yeah. I mean, we talked about how good they were. The C.B. Fry was an example of that. They had the greatest sportsman of his era in their side, C.B. Fry. They also had Geo Smith, who was fantastic roving number 9. He would drop deep. He was a great cricketer as well. He would pick up the ball, and they had a reputation, the Corinthians, and it was often commented on by the press who were used to covering just professional football, that when they played against the top professional teams, they noticed that they played sweeping passes on the move between their forward line, which was really unusual at the time. Things were much more stilted with other clubs. They used to play this interweaving passing game on the move. And it gave a real impression of like wave after wave of Corinthian attack. They weren't always that great defensively, but they had that. And I think that was part of the whole idea of they're not that hung up on points. They weren't nervous. They weren't tense or tight. It was easier for them to turn up on the big day and perform. But had they been in the league, they might have lost some of that. So there was a refusal to, what they call it, pot hunting. Playing in competitions, they called pot hunting. Almost like it was a pejorative term, like it was uncouth in some way to want to win a trophy. It was just this belief that it might in some way change the game for the worse, where teams would be so desperate to win the cup or to win the league that they would cheat, or they would do anything necessary, or that they wouldn't play the most enjoyable or the most beautiful football. They would play the most effective football. Do we want the sport to become that? Was almost their mantra. Do we want the sport to become about effectiveness, both financially and technically on the pitch? Or do we want this to be something above that, something more romantic than that? So in that way, I've been quite harsh on the snooty aspects of the Corinthians, but I actually quite like that idea. But I do love league football. I love the fact that Corinthian-Casuals now have, life or death 6-pointers at the end of the season and things like that. So I can't say I'd like it, but I understand where they were coming from.
The permanent kind of all these wandering sides in the 1870s and 80s, and the lack of structure is what led to the creation originally of the FA Cup, and then the league structure, because people wanted something to compete for, wanted something other than just seeing the same clubs play each other for nothing, effectively. And it's the FA Cup that gives, arguably gives the edge of association football over the rugby football, which remains amateur, as you know, and that led to its own split in the 1890s, where rugby league went its own way, again in the north. No coincidence that the same forces that made association football professional in the 1880s, which was northern clubs wanting to earn some money, working class sides, exactly what happens with the break in the rugby code in the 1890s.
There was a split in football, association football, in 1907 between the amateur clubs and the professional clubs. the Corinthians had always been happy, and the Casuals were always happy to play against professional teams, so professional players. They understood that it was just a different way of looking at it. But I suppose it crossed the line for them when the FA put professionals on the committees, on the boards of the local FAs and the central FA, because they believed then that those people would act in the interests of commerce and finance. It's one thing for a club to do that, but if the people running the game are doing that, then they felt like then it really was going to be lost. And they split with the FA and formed the amateur FA. It only lasted 7 years before everyone was reconciled in 1914, but there was a rugby league, rugby union style split for those 7 years, and they were only able to play against public school old boy teams and things like that. So that's why they went touring. That's one of the reasons why. I mean, they were already going touring in some places because they weren't in the cup and other teams were more interested in the cup. But a big reason was this is the only thing they could do. So in 1910, they go to Brazil. And, you know, the rest is history. Corinthians Paulista are formed off the back of watching Corinthian Football Club perform in Sao Paulo one day. And they're now one of the biggest clubs in Brazil, Corinthians, one of the biggest clubs in the world, let's be honest. Tens of millions of fans. And all of these people are aware that they were born out of people watching an English amateur team touring in Brazil. So that's where it really becomes deeply enshrined in the growth of world football, is you see our name, literally our name, attached to one of the great teams in football. A team that's nickname is O Time do Povo, the team of the poor. So totally at odds with what the Corinthian Football Club were. And that's so beautiful. Like I just think it's brilliant. It just shows you how football moves with the times and moves with geography. And whatever community Corinthians visited, they impacted the growth of the game and encouraged people and enthused people to play it. You can sniff at a lot of aspects of the club, but you can't really sniff at that. It's a fantastic thing. The Americans, front page news when we visited in 1906, the Corinthians are coming. Headlines, you know. It's a real big thing. That was partly because the professional teams were bored of playing the same teams over and over again, and we're now competing for the league. Corinthians went, well, we'll take our show on the road, and they went around the world. But one thing I haven't touched on is the England side of things. You know, Chris mentioned it. England were losing to Scotland heavily, and Pa Jackson wanted to form a club at which the best English players could play together so that England would be a better combination team. They wouldn't just be a team of individuals. For the next 25 years after Corinthian were formed in 1882, something like a third of England internationals were Corinthians.
Wow.
For the next 25 years. In 1894 and 1895, we played Wales, 2 years in a row, as we used to. All 11 players were Corinthians. We should point out that, in those days, if you were a Corinthian, you weren't always playing for Corinthian Football Club, because we keep saying we weren't in the league. So you might play for Old Carthusians as well. You might even play for a team in the Cup or in the league. Normally an amateur one like Swifts or something like that. And then when the Corinthians had a game, you came back and played for them. So some of these England internationals, there were 11 Corinthians on the pitch, but they might have played 20 games for another club that year and 2 for Corinthians. But they were still Corinthians.
Isn't it the case that most, I think until not quite, it's a couple of decades ago that Tottenham overtook Corinthians as the club that's provided the most England players, isn't it? Something like that?
Yeah, very recently. I think Tottenham and Aston Villa are now above us. But the thing is, we're revising that number as we speak, actually. We're looking into that because Corinthians would count members. For example, for a long time, they would say we had 80-something England internationals, which would still make us the most. However, we've looked into that, and some of those were founding members of the club who had retired. They played for England in the 10 years before Corinthian were formed. And I think, by modern standards, you wouldn't say some guy who was on the coaching staff at Chelsea but had played for England before he joined the coaching staff was a Chelsea England international. So, we're trying to revise it by modern standards. It come down by about 15 players.
And at the time of foundation, Scotland were better, and a lot of them were being drawn from one club, which is Queen's Park. So they were used to playing with each other, I should say, as well. So, as you mentioned, the sort of part of the move to get Corinthians going was to have people to play together as a team rather than bringing together individuals and make it gel, which is still England's problem today. Team of individuals.
They brought in the captain of that Scotland team that won 6-1 at the Oval, which was Andrew Watson. He's the first black international footballer, born in Guyana to a Scottish father and a Guyanese mother. and moved to England as a schoolboy to get his education here. His sister was moved over as well. And then he went to Glasgow for university and started work there. So while he's there, he begins to play competitive football and becomes a Scotland international. But the Corinthians, when he moved to London, the Corinthians snapped him up, and he's considered to be one of the catalysts for that sweeping passing game I mentioned because of the combination football that Queen's Park and Scotland were playing.
Exactly, that's it. And then, of course, on the other hand, Corinthian is one half of what then became Corinthian-Casuals. Then you have the other club who are Casuals, which is, it's the best way to remember both clubs when the merger eventually takes place. But Casuals, I would say they don't have such a storied history as Corinthian, but they still played a crucial role in the development of the English game. And of course, like many clubs at the time, their name alluded to something much larger than what they were as well.
Yeah, Chris wrote brilliantly about this in his book Origin Stories. He didn't just focus on Corinthian tours, Casuals toured, and often they mimicked the Corinthian tours the year after them. There were 2 or 3 occasions. If you look at the tour Casuals did, it was the Corinthian tour the year before. And the clubs were intertwined way before they amalgamated. Throughout the period we've been talking about, Casuals players were making up a huge proportion of the Corinthian squads. I've told you that the Corinthians used to draw the best players from other teams and they would come and play for Corinthian, almost like a select 11, like the Barbarians or something. Loads of those players were brought in from the Casuals. So there's a huge overlap. And the Casuals sometimes used to complain that if they had a big game at the same time as a Corinthian tour, they would lose because 2 or 3 of their best players were on tour with the Corinthians. It really was a bone of contention. So they had joint committees before they were amalgamated. They were run by the same committee. They both played at the Crystal Palace in the 1920s. So there was a close link, I should point that out. But yeah, they played their own part. There are some tours that we're remembering at the moment that were Casuals tours. They went to the Basque Country in 1923 and they played Athletic Bilbao and they played Real Union Irún, who's a smaller team, still bigger than Casuals, but a smaller team in the 3rd tier of Spanish football. And we dedicated a game to it on non-league day 2 seasons ago. And the Athletic Bilbao London Supporters Club, the Mr. Pentland Club, 4 or 5 of them came to the game. We presented them with some stuff, we took photos. We had Athletic Bilbao gave us a retro shirt to raffle. And we did the same with Tennis Borussia Berlin last year, which was a Corinthian celebration. But this year, we're looking at the 100th anniversary of another Casuals tour to Portugal. So the Casuals were the ones that played Sporting Lisbon, Benfica, Vitória Setúbal. So that will be one that we're looking at. And they also went and played KB, who became one half of FC Copenhagen. Bold Club, who were the other half. They played these 2 teams. B1903, they're called that, yeah. So they amalgamated like Corinthians and Casuals to form FC Copenhagen. And we're looking to celebrate that this year because that was in 1925. So, yeah, the Casuals did a lot. They did a lot. You said, what better way to remember them than keep their name? Well, how about by wearing their colours? You'll know from history that the Corinthians wore crisp white shirts and dark shorts, and Real Madrid took on those colours because Arthur Johnson, one of the first players for Real Madrid, said, why don't we play in the colours of the Corinthians? They're a great side. It's a great myth. I don't know if it's totally a myth. I think it's probably partly true, but it's not. It's oral history. Let's call it that. It's oral history.
Yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. And that's what part of football history is oral history, storytelling. There's a folklore aspect to it. And it's the thing is, there's so much within football today that is about accuracy. And I understand that, don't get me wrong, when we're talking about historic things and how impactful they are, then you need to be accurate. But I'm always quite cautious of completely removing some of the mystery and myth from football, because when you study football history, that's what makes it, for me, fascinating, is that there is a bit of mystery around this. It's like Athletic Bilbao, like you mentioned, with where they got their shirts from. Was it from Stoke? Was it from Sunderland? Was it from Southampton? No one really knows, but that's part of it. And I think a lot of people kind of take on their own identities depending on where they say, a certain club got their shirt colour from.
Yeah, it might have just come up in conversation. You can imagine a group of footballers talking, and one of them says, oh yeah, white like the Corinthians or whatever. But it doesn't mean that was the be all and end all, but it was part of the decision. So I think that's possibly where these things come from. I just finished the point is that we now wear pink and chocolate, which were the Casuals colours. Very Victorian, very Charterhouse. And there's a lovely story behind that, which is that the Charterhouse football master, William Hague Brown, his wife Annie, used to come and watch the games. And the captain of the team later founded Casuals Football Club in 1883, Thomas Blenkiron, alongside Francis Bickley. And it's believed that Blenkiron wanted the team to play in pink because Annie Hay Brown used to come to watch the games in a pink scarf to support Charterhouse. And there's a chance that the brown came from the surname. All his jockeys on his horses used to wear pink and chocolate as well. And some people say that's where the team colours come from. But I think all of it came from the same thing.
Pink is not unheard of in this era as well. Dulwich Hamlet 1893, they play in pink. And Juventus, people don't know, before the Notts County colours came along, they used to start out in pink as well, which was resurrected in the 90s or 2000s as an away shirt, people might remember as well.
Yeah, it was a colour in the Victorian era that didn't have any associations with femininity. So it wasn't unmasculine to wear pink. In case you're wondering, in an era of masculinity, why were they wearing pink? It didn't mean anything along those lines at that time.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, I want to say it was the 1920s. Scotland adopted a kit that had sort of pink and yellow.
That's the Rosebery running. Yeah, that was one of the early sponsors. It goes back to the 1880s. That one does.
Yeah, the 1880s.
Yeah, because Andrew Watson has them on the mural, doesn't he? On the First Hampden.
Yeah, that's right. I think there's one on display in the Scottish Football Museum. But yeah, so you're right that the pink is a really common colour during them, which is really interesting. And I actually didn't know, Dominic, that it was to do with ideas around femininity.
No, well, as in these days, you might think that. In those days, you didn't.
Yeah, the perception, yeah. So those are the stories of the two clubs, and they have huge histories before they choose to merge. They're both such influential clubs within football, not just in England, but across the world, as we've discussed. And they really kind of carry that heritage into this merger, because they then, in 1939, become Corinthian-Casuals. Not the best year to choose to merge. They played one game before World War II kicked off, and then they had to wait for the war to finish. Why did they choose to merge? What was the reason behind the merger? Was it the case that both clubs were stagnating a little bit and they chose to pool the resources?
It's exactly that. The split in 1907 that I spoke about, already by that point, more and more professional teams were able to beat the Corinthians, although they held their own. They used to play in the Sheriff of London Shield, which was the forerunner of the Charity Shield, against the best professional team each year. And they won it less often than they lost it, let's say. But they did win it. After the split, amateur football goes downhill because they're not able to play professional teams anymore. They kind of lose their edge a bit. And then the First World War decimates the amateur class as it decimated the officer class, because that's the same thing. So the Corinthians lost 22. There's a war memorial to the 22 current Corinthians at that time. And it's believed the Casuals lost something like 10, maybe more. But if you include former players, it's now, Lou Walker's done some great work on this. It's now something like 124 Corinthians and Casuals lost their lives in the war, it's a ludicrous amount of loss for a football club.
Yeah, it's devastating for any village. The villages and towns that you see, these tiny places up and down the country that maybe have like a population of 50, and you see the war memorial, and there's more names on it than the population of the place is today. So for football clubs, World War I was catastrophic in many ways.
It was, yeah. As I said earlier, for a football team made up of mainly the officer class, these guys were running out the front with a pistol and a baton, over the top. So you can only imagine how many were lost and how many didn't want to play football again when they came home. But some of them did, and some of them restarted the club. And as a result of that, they did carry on. You'd probably say they limped on, to use a cliche. In the 20s, they started entering the FA Cup because they just weren't relevant enough to draw the crowds or to get the media they needed to continue. They didn't have a home. They couldn't have a home support. So they start playing in the FA Cup, and they win a few. They beat Blackburn in 1924 in the Cup. They battered Norwich 5-0 in the 20s as well when they were a Division 3 South side, but largely they lost. And by the 30s, they were really struggling. Every now and then they put together a good side. That 20s side I talked about that were in the FA Cup were quite good, actually. And they had a couple of Chelsea players, Ben Howard-Baker and A.G. Bauer. Howard-Baker being a goalkeeper, Bauer a fullback. I think Bauer was the last amateur to captain England. They played for Corinthian against Chelsea when Corinthian played Chelsea, because it kind of took precedent to play for the Corinthians still for an amateur player. But going forward, they had a player called FNS Creek and C.T. Ashton. They did still have some excellent players in the 20s. By the 30s, it was really starting to drift. And they struggled. They would lose heavily to teams like Southend in the Cup. even their place in the first round wasn't guaranteed anymore. They had to qualify like all the other non-league clubs, because for a while they were the one amateur team that were allowed straight into the FA Cup. And yeah, they were really struggling for relevance, for money, for quality. Casuals were continuing to play in the Isthmian League in the Amateur Cup, but they had this joint committee thing going on. And I think there was this idea, why don't we just become one club? The Corinthian name lives on. We have a place in the league through the Casuals. We can carry on as a Isthmian League football club called Corinthian-Casuals. Some Corinthians, I think, some old Corinthians really didn't like that. There's some writing of the time of people saying that for them it wasn't Corinthians anymore. But others said, no, this is a way to keep the name going. And I think looking back on it, it would be churlish to say anything other than that. It is the same club. It's a club adapting to its times. And they had that relationship with the Casuals going for so long that it was almost an inevitability that if they were going to help each other out, they would do it as one club. They were already one committee. And that's what happened. So that's why they did. Yeah, you're right. They were just on the wane.
Yeah, it's weird to think about, but I mean, for our listeners who aren't too familiar with the football history side of things, particularly in England, and the same can be said for Scotland as well, many of the early sort of pioneers of the game fell away, and in many cases fell out of existence as well. I think Scotland are quite lucky in that two of our early most successful clubs are still in existence in Queen's Park and Dumbarton. But then, of course, you have Renton, who were the first champions of the world, in air quotes. You have clubs like Third Lanark, who are so famous now. I mean, with England, you had so many early clubs. Wanderers, again, comes to mind. Old Carthusians, you've mentioned, who have fallen away from existence. Some of them have reformed, but they can't, in my opinion, they can't really claim to have the same sort of thread of continuity that Corinthian-Casuals does. So would you say that, or would you agree with me that it's actually quite rare that Corinthian-Casuals have managed to survive into the modern day, but also really cemented this heritage, I suppose, that they do have a heritage of this, of recognising when they need to adapt and change to changes within the game to actually survive, because it is quite rare that a club as early as Corinthian-Casuals have managed to survive.
Yeah, it remains a unique club, but you're right, they've changed with the times. That was their secret. In 1898, they changed their constitution to enter the Sheriff of London Shield, which I just mentioned. They didn't consider it pot hunting then, did they? In the 1920s, they entered the FA Cup because they realised you need to remain relevant. People want to see the Corinthians play in what matters now, and the FA Cup was what mattered then. Then in 1939, they merged with Casuals and entered the league. They realised to maintain a football club, you need to play regularly. You need to be in a league. You need to be moving with the times. Okay, when amateurism changed to semi-professionalism, they didn't change that. They didn't move the goalpost. But by that point, these aren't just Oxbridge players anymore. These aren't Eton, Harrow, Charterhouse players anymore. Some of them were still then. They haven't been for a while now. But at that point in the 70s, some of them were. They still, in the late 60s, early 70s, would have Oxford and Cambridge footballers there. But they also were starting to see blue-collar players, working-class players come through. By the early 80s, we reached the FA Cup first round with Billy Smith, who runs a market stall on Covent Garden, as manager, and half the players came from the flower market. The other half were ex-youth system players, trainees and apprentices from professional clubs like Crystal Palace and Fulham. You had Alan Pardew playing for us, who was a glazier nearby. You had Andy Gray, who went on to play for Aston Villa, Crystal Palace and England, and later came back as manager for us, not too successfully. You had Tony Finnegan, who went on to play for Crystal Palace and Dundee and Fulham. And they were all playing in this team that reached the FA Cup first round. They were a proper working class non-league football club from London, and they made it into the first round. This was the Corinthian-Casuals. So they moved with the times. That year, they had 2 players sent off in one game. The committee used to say, if you get a red card playing for Corinthians or Corinthian-Casuals, you can't play for them again. You've disgraced the club's name. In 1982, Billy Smith appeals and those 2 players go before the committee, and the committee decide that they're going to overrule that and change it. If you did something, depends what you got sent off for, it changed it, right? Which actually I kind of understand, right? Because the game changed. It's like Gary Lineker never got booked, but he probably would have done these days, right? So, the game's changed. You're going to pick up bookings for a late challenge now. And if you do 2 of those and get sent off, you're not a Corinthian.
Yeah, I suppose it's kind of like, if... And this goes back to what we were talking about, the perception within the Victorian era and the ideals behind being a Corinthian. If you get sent off, and even if it was unfair, then they would probably say, well, you shouldn't have been putting yourself in a position where the referee would consider that, Whereas kind of moving into this time period, you're thinking, well, if the ref's being a bit unfair, and you were just challenging for the ball and he's made a mistake, fair enough. But, if you punch someone or you headbutt someone, then,
yes,
that's, yeah, exactly. That's grounds for you to get booted out and probably get some jail time as well.
Just to have a quick shout out to some other very old football clubs that are still going from this era that predate Corinthians, as you mentioned, heritage-wise. So the only clubs that are still going from actually at the first meeting of the Football Association, 1863, is the Civil Service FC still going. And Blackheath, which is the world's oldest rugby club, because they didn't continue with association, they went rugby route. There's also Royal Engineers in Chatham, who won the FA Cup in 1875 and actually were credited with pioneering the combination game, but obviously don't have quite the profile perhaps as Queen's Park does. So, there's that debate to be had another time. But ultimately, these clubs are still going. But I think what Corinthian-Casuals do differently is they really have put history first and foremost as part of their marketing. So we say credit to Dominic and Lou and all the other guys down there for doing that.
I suppose if you look at clubs that have changed names as well, you've got Manchester United, who of course were Newton Heath. You've got Arsenal as well, who were Royal Arsenal, Greenwich Arsenal.
Dial Square, yeah. If anyone's interested in that, by the way, I just recently did a blog post on the Premier League table of 24-25 as it finished, but with their original names.
Oh, that's class.
Actually about
nice.
3 or 4 clubs that actually still have their original names because they're the more modern founded ones, like Chelsea, for example. But there's also the whole debate as well on that around Crystal Palace and whether Crystal Palace is the original 1861 or if it's the 1905, I think they were, or 1901, I can't remember exactly. But either which way, they only played about 6 times between 1861 and 1900 something. So they're not really a continuity club in that regard. But there is some connection between the original Crystal Palace. And I've done a video on that if anyone's interested.
Yeah, it's quite interesting how, when you talk about these kind of threads of continuity, how clubs can obviously go defunct and then reform, but reformed by the people who were involved in the original. So, it's always has to be taken on a case-by-case basis, when we look at these kind of things historically. But as you said, Chris, Corinthian-Casuals have put history and heritage first and foremost. And moving into the 80s and 90s, that's even more apparent when they're still going tours around the world. And when they play Corinthians in Brazil, Socrates turns out for them, which is absolutely amazing. It's one of my favourite footballing stories. But like you said, for a club of Corinthian-Casuals level, despite the historic stature, to be able to still go on tours to Brazil is just amazing.
Yeah. I mean, 88, the year you've mentioned, that was the first time the amalgamated Corinthian-Casuals went back to Brazil, because they'd been, I think, in the year after. So they went in 1910, Corinthians were formed. They went a year later. And they were going to South America, actually, when the First World War broke out, and they arrived on a boat in Brazil. The tour was due to be in Argentina and Uruguay, but they arrived in Brazil. So that was the only land they touched. And they turned around and went straight home to serve in the war. So 100 years later, it ended up being 101. Chris Watney, an ex-Corinthian-Casuals player, he led the team back in 2015 to fulfill that South American tour, albeit we went to Brazil. And for obvious reasons, we'd never played the first team of Corinthians. In 88, when we went back, we played the All-Stars, which included Rivellino, Gilmar and Socrates, who I think he played a quarter of the game for Corinthian-Casuals, having scored the only goal of the game for Corinthians All-Stars. He almost equalised his own goal, but he hit the bar and it ended 1-0 to the All-Stars. So they went back in 88. It was the same year that we broke another tradition. We stopped being nomadic. We moved into a ground in 88. So it was a really big year. That's when we moved to Tolba. Then they went back in 2001. That's like the forgotten Brazil tour for some reason. No one ever mentions it, which is a real shame because it was equally important. I think they played the Corinthian under-21s out there, and they played a few games against the amateur team, Sao Paulo Athletic Club, who had invited us over in the first place in 1910. That's why we were in Sao Paulo to play that game. And that was Charles Miller's club, the grandfather of football in Brazil, who played once for Corinthians. She got all of this history wrapped up in it. 2015, they go back, and Chris, ex-player, he's organised this tour. He's also a film director. He made a film, a great documentary film called Brothers in Football about that tour, which I'm sure people have seen, and if they haven't, they must. They lost 3-0 to the first team of Corinthians, which isn't bad, 3 years after Corinthians won the Club World Cup. They held out for quite a long time as well. I think it was 0-0 at half-time. So not that on the pitch is the most important thing about those occasions, but they did themselves proud. They really performed well. And I think it brought the club back into the mainstream media for a while, to the point where it couldn't have gone better. The following season, a guy called James Bracken took over as manager. And I've talked about how Corinthian-Casuals generally are bottom 40 throughout history. I mean, they've won the league once, ever. whether it be Casuals Football Club or Corinthian-Casuals, they've only ever won the league once, and that was the lowest ebb. It was when they got relegated to the Spartan League Senior Division and they won it to come back to some level of football. They were literally at the lowest level of senior football, but they did win the league. That was in '86. There's an anniversary actually coming up. But under James Bracken, over the next few years after that tour in 2015, the club got promoted. So they went into the Isthmian Premier Division, which is an absolute miracle. In the late 2010s, to reach the third tier of non-league football as an amateur club, absolutely incredible. The team should have completely fallen away. Instead, they were going up. And that's when we went back to Hungary and played there 115 years after helping to found the Corinthian Cup, which was the first cup competition in Hungarian football. So a really magical time. I did go on that tour. Unfortunately, after James left, as is often the case when an iconic manager with a great group of players departs, we were relegated back to back. And so we now find ourselves where you might imagine the only amateur team in the pyramid to be, which is where I suppose our expenses budget is probably a mid-table budget, so we can no longer claim to be total underdogs at the level we're at, albeit, there will still be teams throwing money at promotion that we have to try and compete with. So we're in the Combined Counties Premier Division South, which is a mouthful. We've got a player who was part of that James Bracken era, Moo Marn, as our manager. And the hope is that, we can rebound from those 2 years that we don't talk about.
Well, I suppose it's quite a nice lead in to what I was going to ask you next, Dominic. Obviously, with the heritage of Corinthian-Casuals, and as Chris alluded to earlier, you guys really put a huge focus on that and really try and put it first. Would you say that competing for trophies and competing for points is still secondary, and promoting the history and heritage of the club as a way to grow it still takes prominence? I can see by the look in your face that's maybe not necessarily the case, but like you said there, with the club now back in the Combined Counties League South and with the kind of mid-table budget that you have, would you say that this is maybe more in line with the history of the club now than if for example, someone started funneling money into the club and you started working your way up the non-league tiers to even make it to the National League South, for instance?
Yeah, we want to win. No, that's really important. Like, if I said anything else, it would be a lie. And players want to play for us because we're ambitious. At the same time, that's not an at all costs thing. And that's the difference, right? There's a level of the way you carry yourself that we expect. There's a level of respect for our heritage that is much higher than at any other club, I think. And that means that, yeah, you're right. Occasionally, people will see the film or will know the name and will see the history, or they might be Brazilian, and they'll go, why isn't this club turning professional and going for the Premier League? Why aren't they doing a Wrexham and making a documentary about their rise through the leagues with a billionaire owner? And I get local businessmen sometimes when I go around asking them to put posters up in their windows and stuff saying, oh, what's the club about? And I tell them the story, or sometimes they'll know. And sometimes they might come from Portugal, or they might come from the USA, or they might come from the Middle East, and they'll say, why don't you go professional? With the amount of support you've got in Brazil, you imagine the merchandise money you can make. Imagine where you could go with that. And imagine who would want to invest. But here's the point, Rory. Have you seen how many times super wealthy people invest in non-league teams and it goes absolutely awfully? It goes well for a while. The fans will love 2 or 3 years of promotions. You will reach a level where you have to level out. And suddenly that becomes the level you're at. So, okay, you become a yo-yo team between League One and League Two, do you? Or you become a yo-yo team between the National League South and the Isthmian Premier Division, whatever the level might be that finance takes you to. And for that, you've sold everything.
Correct.
So you have to be really, really, really careful about this. That's not to say it can't happen, but it would need to be a groundswell from within the club, and it would need to be passed by 2/3 of the members at an AGM and ratified. But that's the only way you can change the constitution and become a club that has an owner. We don't have an owner. We're run by a committee. We always have been. So you can't own Corinthian-Casuals at the moment. That's really important to us. It's a big deal. We only recently became a company by limited guarantee. Otherwise, you've got quite a lot of concerns financially as members if something goes wrong. You don't want people hunting you down at your home address because you turn up to run the turnstile on match days saying you owe us 100 grand. So, we had to become a company by limited guarantee because we were no longer run by super wealthy posh guys. But, at the same time, it's still a committee run club. So in answer to your question, if someone benevolent with a great vision for the club won over 2/3 of the committee and we decided to do that, that's one thing. But any old wheeler dealer coming in saying, I can take you up the leagues, we can sort something out, we'll put a new stand in. They might. They've done it at other clubs, but those other clubs, I would say more than half of the time, you wave them going back in the other direction and they end up becoming AFC, that town's name, in the counties league somewhere.
That's a really fair point, actually. It's nice, though, to get a balance. And, we've had a couple of episodes this year where people have said, like, yes, it's good to win and it's good to make our way up the leagues, but sustainability comes first. And I think that that is good, but I like how you've admitted that you want to win, and that's great, but you're not going to do it at the expense of the club. You're not going to sacrifice the history and the heritage of the club to be able to do that, and I think that is really important, particularly for a club like Corinthian-Casuals.
Can I just jump in and say that Corinthians spirit has kind of mirrored somewhat in Corinthians in Brazil, Corinthians Paulista, because that is a really significant club in the Brazilian context as well. So if we go back to the time 1910 when they toured, and these 5 railway workers were turning up watching this game against a team called Palmeiras, which is not the same Palmeiras as the shirt you're wearing at the time. But it was not a working class game at this point. It was for usually not just entirely British and German expat community or upper class Brazilians at this point, but it wasn't accessible to working class people. So Corinthians Paulista helped part of that democratization of the sport within the country. Not only that, 7 decades later, with Socrates, as we mentioned before, was doing the Corinthians democracy thing. So at the tail end of the dictatorship that had been going since 1964, he was encouraging people with messages on the shirt like "Dia 15 voci," which basically means like vote on the 15th, which was trying to encourage people to go out and vote. They obviously had a generation without democracy, so no one knew what to do in terms of voting. They had no idea, and they were also just kind of scared to go as well. But Corinthians had break that down. People like Socrates, Walter Casagrande, who was another great striker for Corinthians, and they still are very active. Torcida, an ultra group that actually is kind of quite into sort of the democratization as well. They're very anti some of the things that the former president Bolsonaro was doing at the time. I remember that, especially during COVID and stuff. So they still have that sort of like important legacy and significant political significance in Brazil, the Brazilian Corinthians, as the sort of Corinthians do in England in terms of ethic, I think, and they're far more politically significant. But one of the questions I want to should also a quick shout out to Exeter City, who is another club that has a connection with Brazil because they first played Brazil, and I think Socrates turned out for them, didn't he, at some point in one of the anniversaries, maybe. But I just wanted to ask Dominic, you said that the tour 1914 was originally, the idea was to go to Argentina and Uruguay. Do you know who they were due to play there, and is there any plans to perhaps fulfil that objective? Because I would very much like to come along to that.
I don't know who they were due to play, unfortunately. The newspaper doesn't specify. It's only really talked about occasionally that was the case because I think a lot of people assume that we were meant to go to Brazil because that's where they docked. But wouldn't that be great? The problem is, if you raise enough money to go on a tour to South America and you're Corinthian-Casuals, you're going to Brazil. We've got tens of thousands of fans who want to see us play there. So I think we would do that. Maybe you could take in a little couple of days in Buenos Aires or something, Montevideo. That wouldn't be bad, would it?
I just wanted to quick shout out for Fielondres, actually, because they do add a hell of an atmosphere. It's very unique in the non-league. And even the aesthetic when you go to Corinthian-Casuals at Tolworth is, the Vai Corinthians and all that sort of like, slogans in Portuguese, pictures of Socrates. Do you know what I mean? So it's kind of, there is that bridge between the two, and they do add, a great atmosphere. I've done an interview again with them on YouTube if anyone wants to check that out. Keep plugging my content that is relevant to this. But no, they add a lot of atmosphere, so I totally recommend if you are going to go to Corinthian-Casuals. If you don't want to, because it's not too far from central London, Waterloo Station, you should definitely try and coincide it with when Fielondres go.
We have people turn up directly from the airport with their luggage because the first thing they want to do in London as a Corinthians fan is to see where the Corinthian-Casuals play. And can you imagine, of all the things to see in London, you turn up at a 2,000 capacity corrugated iron non-league ground in Tolworth on the A3.
I mean, you are literally walking down the side of the A3, it's dual carriageway. To get to the ground. It is the least glamorous introduction one could possibly have.
It really is. It's so at odds with the club's traditions, this haughty yet not haughty, nomadic middle-class football club that now are really a non-league football club playing in a semi-professional leagues in a tiny non-league stadium. But it's brilliant. I absolutely love it. And I think it's great we've moved with the times and dropped that class thing. It's embarrassing. I wouldn't be part of the club if it was about private schools and Oxbridge education anymore. You've got to be for everyone. We've got a really good, strong, dedicated local support. The Brazilians come 4 or 5 times a season, but the people of Tolworth come every single game and they sing more than anyone in this division. And we get comments from opposition fans and committee one way or the other about our support at the end of every game. Either they're delighted that someone came down and sang, or they're absolutely mortified that that many people have turned up at their tiny ground in the home counties with stickers and chants. But it's a unique club, but we've really got a lot to look forward to. We're currently improving the ground. We've got a new clubhouse gone up. We've got a new outdoor bar, which is named Rogers after our longest term supporter, Roger Stringer. We really celebrate these things as well. We're a club that's currently looking to push forward and to grow within the identity that we've always been proud to uphold. So it's good. It's a good place to come.
A unique club is the best way of putting it. I think the fact that a non-league club in England today, to still exist, to still be able to trace that thread back to their roots, but to also have fan clubs who come to see the club actively from all over the world is incredibly unique. It's incredibly special, and it's something that you should be proud to have if you support Corinthian-Casuals. My last question for you, Dom, is more from a personal interest point of view. Your role within the club is obviously head of communications and heritage. When I was doing my master's dissertation, one of the things that I studied was the role of heritage within football clubs in Scotland. And there's only, well, at the time I wrote that, which is 2022, there was only one football club in Scotland that actually had a dedicated in-house heritage department that had that name, and that was Hearts. It's just quite interesting to me that none of our professional clubs seem to be able to do it, but a non-league club playing in one of the lowest divisions in England is able to do it. And as you mentioned earlier, there's a number of historians that actually actively work with Corinthian-Casuals to be able to study and trace that history. So I just want you to tell me, from what you know and from your work within the club, how important is heritage to Corinthian-Casuals? Because it sounds like it's vital to the survival of the club.
Yeah, it's what sets us apart from other non-league clubs, isn't it? It's what makes us different, other than the fact that we don't have the name of a place in our title. Yeah, we're really proud of our heritage. And I think every generation, 2 or 3 people like me come along who are fascinated by it and want to dig into it. And we see what the people before us have done. And we kind of look for that. Oh, what's the sticking point? What's the point you got stuck on? I'll see if I might know someone who knows something about that. And you try and uncover, like recently I uncovered 3 lineups from 1925 that were previously unknown by the club statistician. And I was able to say, oh, a Danish journalist sent me the team from the 3 games in Copenhagen. Here you go. So, things like that are small pleasures, but the overall idea of being a kind of guardian of the heritage, a custodian of the heritage, it would be a real shame if you let it go. And there are so many people that have been passionate over the years that have built up a level of insight and record into our history. When I arrived at the club, I thought, well, there isn't currently someone doing that, and I'm into that stuff. So let me pick up the baton and take that on from people like Chris Watney, people like Lou Walker, Norman Epps before that. I want to name them because otherwise it's not right. And Rob Cavallini, of course, who's written the history of these 3 clubs, Corinthian Football Club, Casuals Football Club, and Corinthian-Casuals. And he was a programme editor there for many years. He was responsible for bringing Man United down. He wrote a letter to Alex Ferguson saying, we're approaching the centenary of Manchester United's heaviest defeat. Were you aware? They lost 11-3 to Corinthian Football Club in 1903. Would you be interested in a rematch? And Alex Ferguson sent the reserve team down to play us in pre-season, managed by Brian McClare and Ricky Sprazier.
Do you think there's ever a chance that Corinthians Paulista will actually come to Tolworth, or do you think that would just be undoable from a capacity point of view?
It would be, wouldn't it? We'd have to put something in place, and I don't know how you would manage it. I don't know if there's enough stewards in the world to manage every Corinthians fan in Europe just deciding to turn up.
I think it's quite good, though, that through the work that you and your team have done in terms of promoting the heritage of the club, you have built up this kind of network. And, a lot of people from the outside looking in might think, well, it's quite weird that Manchester United would get back to a small amateur club in the lower reaches of English football. But in actuality, and I've found this myself, is that within football, if there's something authentic, generally speaking, if you ask nicely, then you'll get it. And that's the whole thing about building networks, So I think it's really important that you keep building these networks, keep promoting the club using the heritage like that.
Thank you. And one more thing I would add is the volunteers that we have. we're very fortunate in that respect. There are other clubs at our level and above that are paying agencies or, up and coming media people to run their media, and it's great. It does wonders for those clubs that do that. Because we're a volunteer-run club, sometimes you get someone particularly talented that just wants to volunteer, and we've got people like that. We're lucky in that respect. I talked about our chairman Brian. He's a builder, and he wants to improve the ground. We've got another guy, Brian Phillips, who you see him on the turnstile on match days, but he helped build our ground with his bare hands, with his brother, from offcuts of other stadiums at the time. Havant and Waterlooville changed colours because they merged, so we took their seats. Dulwich Hamlet moved from one Champion Hill to another, so we got the corrugated iron from their stand and built a stand out of it ourselves. Well, I say we. Brian and Roger Phillips did this. And they are icons of our club. They're volunteers. Stuart Tree, who does you see our graphics and our video work on social media. That's a guy called Stuart. He's the ultimate all-rounder, marketer, graphic designer, videographer, writer. He's edited the program before I started doing it. And he had to eventually kind of let things go because he's got a family, he's got a life. Fortunately, I was there, or unfortunately, I was there to kind of make it a double act, and my wife's a graphic designer. But we just have all of this stuff, but we're volunteers and we do that stuff for a living, so we bring it. And, one of these days, a great, documentary maker or someone who wants to make TikTok reels will suddenly turn up and we'll add another string to our bow. That's the hope always, that someone walks through that door, loves the club and wants to do it.
When I visited for that field Andrishka, I think it was Chipstead, I think you were playing, wasn't it, a while ago. And there were at least 2 Italian content creators there. So this is Corinthian-Casuals is getting noticed in places other than UK and Brazil.
I think that's the beautiful thing about this kind of ground hopping trend. I think with ground hopping and with TikTok and sort of vlogging at match days becoming more of a thing, I think it's opened the gates for a lot of clubs at either amateur, semi-pro or non-league level to have new fans come through the gates. Basically, some of these people have huge reaches. Depending on how they promote it, can be massive for getting different people through the gates. And I think volunteers at that level are so vital to clubs. But like you said, Dom, when you get someone who comes through the door who loves the club, who wants to be a part of this, but they also have like a really, sometimes niche, but they're really talented at doing these specific things, particularly around marketing, it can be huge. Like really, really huge for clubs at that level.
Yeah, photography. Look at the level of our photography compared to most non-league clubs. It makes all the difference.
Yeah, no, I mean, there are some really interesting cultures in the London non-league scene. You mentioned Dulwich Hamlet, also Clapton. These are getting big crowds because they've got slightly political edge to those, or inclusive edge to those. But what Corinthians' USP is the history and the heritage and the Brazilian connection, and I think they use that really well. Like I said, combined with excellent photography and videography.
I mean, that's how you do it. You can't always just rely on heritage or using heritage because it's just one part in this massive kind of, you always need to bring it into marketing. And part of my interest is how heritage is used in club marketing. Is it just for short-term gains, or is it something that the club do all the time because they're interested in their heritage, and how that then kind of translates into club culture, supporter values, and how the supporters engage with their clubs. And I think using heritage long term and throughout a club's marketing strategy is really important, and the clubs that do that have such a better connection with their fans than those who don't.
It's making a comeback as well. I think in history, if you think about the attention that Andrew Watson, who we mentioned before, has been getting in the last 10 years, he was largely forgotten for a century and a bit. And so he's now been coming back. I live quite near to where Isaac Newell's from, who is the guy whose son founded Newell's Old Boys in Argentina. And there's now a push to get a statue of Isaac Newell in Rochester. So it's kind of these, people in Rochester may not know it, even have heard of Newell's Old Boys, but they will have heard of Gabriel Batistuta, Mauricio Pochettino, Diego Maradona, Lionel Messi. These are people that have pulled on the famous red and black of Newell's Old Boys. And you can connect with people with that sort of messaging that they can relate to. And then you can then sort of push that heritage. So you're part of that. Your town is part of that story. And here's how we're going to celebrate it.
Absolutely, yeah. We had a guy called John Forrest and another local community figure, Robin Hutchinson, who made a real big play for that. They were the ones that got me involved. The whole idea was, look what's in Tolworth. This is incredible. You've got, locally, you've got this and you can go along. And people from Surbiton and Kingston have started going along as well now. That makes a huge difference. And luckily, we've got a manager who switched onto it. Last season, we had 5 Brazilian players, 6 maybe Brazilian players, and they really love it. They love the story behind it. They're very good footballers. The fans love them and they've bought into it. And when we can do at the end of the game, when I can pass my mobile phone to a Corinthians fan who's just played 90 minutes for Corinthian-Casuals, and he can tell people with a selfie video in Sao Paulo in Portuguese with a Sao Paulo accent what's just happened in Tolworth 10 minutes ago, and we can upload it to Instagram. You can imagine how quickly that hits.
Nailed it. That's how it's done. I love that. Guys, this has been an amazing chat. It's been great, and I think what's been great as well is that towards the end there, we've kind of married how Corinthian Casuals actually use their heritage to promote themselves in the modern day, how they're using social media and things, along with this really incredible history that the club and the two clubs who merged to become Corinthian Casuals have. I don't think it can really be understated how influential Corinthian Casuals have been on the game in England and abroad. For a non-league and up until very recently amateur club to have such a strong connection with football in Brazil is just incredible. And if any of our listeners aren't familiar with the full story of Corinthian Casuals, then I would highly recommend you go and read up on it. Go and check out the work that Dom and his team are doing. Just before we finish up, Chris, you mentioned it earlier. I am always a fan of you plugging your work in this show.
Yeah, you can follow me on social media on BlueSky, Instagram and YouTube. It's Outside Right. That's WRITE.
And you can go and check all of the ground hopping that Chris does, all of the research into historic football clubs. Buy one of his 3 books. He's got Origin Stories, he's got Defiant, and he's got Shades of Green, which was this year's publication. All fantastic reads, and they really delve into some historic and important context for football around the world. Thank you very much to all of our listeners who tuned in to the show once again. If you have any questions about this episode, or if you want to reach out and suggest a topic, you can DM us an X, that's @_footyheritage, or you can email us at hello@footballheritage.co.uk. If you've listened to this on Apple or Spotify, consider leaving us a review or following us. It does wonders for us, for the algorithm, in terms of pushing us in front of new listeners. But for now, Chris, say goodbye.
Goodbye.
Dom, say goodbye.
Goodbye.
It's goodbye from me as well. We'll see you all again next week. Goodbye.